Chapter 1. From the top of the gorge, it had just looked like a plate of spaghetti. But now, as DS Rachel Blunt neared closer, a wreathing liquefaction of body parts took shape, and she fought back the urge to vomit. Stopping just short of the stomach-churning scene, a raucous screeching suddenly filled the air, and she turned her attention skyward. Her eyes struggled to focus against the cold, white glare of the autumn sun, and she lifted her hand instinctively to act as a visor. When her eyes finally adjusted to the light, the horror at her feet was instantly outdone, and she gasped at the spectacle of a disembodied head tangled precariously in the cords of a lime green bungee rope. Worse still, some of the victim's vertebrae and spinal cord were still attached, and they trailed wickedly like a cadaverous rat's tail. Another screech drew Rachel's attention to the black kites that hovered overhead, and she watched as the winged raptors darted back and forth, ripping chunks of flesh with their talons. And, when did you discover the body? She asked with a gulp. She lowered her hand and looked to her companion as he answered. She wanted to read his body language as he replied, as it often said much more than the words themselves. Scotty James was noticeably on edge, a little green at the gills even. Perhaps his hard man image only extended to the world of extreme sports that he'd made his career.
I don't know really. It was probably about 7 when I found him, I suppose. Or maybe it was 7:30. I'm not really sure.
When I found him, Rachel repeated in her head. The dangling head and spine was barely discernible as a human being, yet Scotty was clearly convinced that it was a man. So you're positive it's a man and not a woman? How can you be sure?
Well, it's Jono Hart, isn't it? He was one of Dad's friends.
And how do you know that? Rachel asked. The victim's face had been obliterated by the birds, and what little flesh remained now hung from the cheekbones in ragged strips.
I could tell it was Jono as soon as I saw him, said Scotty. But the birds have been pretty busy since then, so yeah, I guess it's hard to tell now. You do know who Jono Hart is, don't you?
Rachel knew exactly who he was. He was a TV fishing celebrity, and her boyfriend was obsessed with the man. And what about the body? She asked. In what sort of condition was that when you first arrived this morning?
Yeah, that looked pretty much the same as it does now. Those eels are vicious bastards, and once they get a scent for blood, they rip everything to shreds.
Rachel studied the pool of body parts in front of her, and once again she had to fight down her urge to vomit. The long-fin eels had thrashed and churned their way through the victim's body, leaving the torso an empty cage of death. The eels were of varying size, with some almost 4 feet in length, and the others, although smaller, were more snake-like and appeared to be just as ferocious. Their smaller bodies had allowed them to bury their way through the cartilage that connected the victim's rib bones, and now they were gouging their way through the tendons that held his kneecaps in place.
So how long do you think it'll be before I can reopen the bridge?
Asked Scotty.
I've got swingers booked in all next week, and I've already had to cancel $1,000 worth of business.
Rachel was appalled at his lack of compassion, but she'd never heard of bungee jumpers referred to as swingers before. Swingers? She asked. Surely they're jumpers, aren't they?
Nah, we don't bungee very often these days. It's just the odd 1 or 2 per week since the new dam made it too shallow for submersion jumps. Nah, I'm talking about our latest attraction, a bridge swing. It's called Swing to Riches.
Swing to riches, said the policewoman. How can a bridge swing make you rich?
Ah, well, now that's the cool part, isn't it? It's the gold.
Gold? Said Rachel, her interest piqued.
Yeah, that's right. Every swing gives you the chance to strike gold. Cool idea, eh?
Scotty stood there looking smug, like a cat who'd got the cream. He was a tall, athletic-looking man with a mahogany tan and sun-bleached hair that made him look like a California surf bum. He certainly didn't look like a business genius.
And how exactly do your swingers strike gold?
Rachel asked.
Oh, it's pretty straightforward. We give them a gold pen, you see, and every time they reach the bottom of the swing arc, they lean back and they scoop up some of the riverbed. Those old timers from the gold rush didn't have the mining equipment we've got these days, so there's plenty of nuggets left to find. Well, that's what I tell the tourists anyway.
Rachel raised an eyebrow. Scotty clearly didn't realise that he'd just admitted to fraud. But before she could say anything, he seemed to sense her unease and decided to caveat his words.
And even if there are none of the big nuggets left, there's still plenty of smaller flakes to find, of course.
I'll have to take your word for that, I'm afraid,
said Rachel.
I don't know very much about gold swinging, or gold panning, or whatever it is you're calling this thing.
The mention of gold had secured Rachel's attention, not because she was interested in Scotty's stupid idea, but because wherever there was gold, there was probably a motive for murder. She pulled out a pen and made a note in her pad.
Contact Queenstown District Council in relation to possible health and safety breach at Moat Creek Activities Company. Potential risk of broken limbs due to extreme nature of bridge swing attraction.
Although she didn't know much about gold panning, Rachel doubted there was much left to find these days anyway. Nearby Arrowtown had been the centre of New Zealand's gold mining industry for well over 100 years, and tens of thousands of prospectors had stripped the land bare in search of the precious metal.
Well, Mr. James, I'm sorry, but you're going to be closed for at least a couple of days, I'm afraid. At least until we've gathered all the body parts and searched the area for evidence. I'm sure you wouldn't want your guests to find any stray fingers or toes in their gold pans now, would you?
Well, no, I suppose not.
Rachel looked up again at the birds scavenging above. There wasn't going to be much evidence left to collect if the recovery team didn't arrive soon. She studied the victims' eviscerated remains, and as her eyes drifted up towards the bridge that suspended them, a small movement suddenly caught her attention. 100 feet away, on the northern side of the river, a figure stood watching from the cover of a large granite boulder. The voyeur's presence angered the policewoman, and she turned squarely to face them, keen to show that they had not gone unnoticed. But when the person saw her returning their gaze, they shrank back into the shadows, like a shade sucked down to the underworld. Rachel wasn't easily spooked, but it was creepy being watched like that, and a shiver ran down her spine. For a moment, she thought about shouting out to the unwanted visitor, but she had a hunch that this person wasn't going to respond willingly, and so she turned to Scotty instead.
Do you know who that was just now, watching us from the rocks?
Sorry, I didn't see anyone, I'm afraid. It could have been a tourist, I suppose, or perhaps a local out for a run.
Whoever it was, they certainly didn't want to be seen, and Rachel wanted to know why. But for now, she had more important things on her mind, like how she was going to recover her victim before the birds and the eels left nothing for her to save.